Welcome everyone to the Septober PF topic lecture on border surveillance. And before we get started with the actual topic lecture, we'll each kind of introduce ourselves a bit. So I'm Leo. I'm a PF debater. I've been doing it for about 4 years now. I go to Saratoga High, and some of my accomplishments are semifinaling at TOC and Berkeley, and also winning TOC Digital Series 2. And in this photo over here, that's my partner and I, Ashish at Berkeley from this year.
Perfect. And I'm Josh. I'll also be with you all today. I'm currently a policy and LD debater at Western Kentucky University. As well, I coach at Ivy Bridge Academy. This is my 8th year in debates. I just wanted to shout out real quick, as I know that people watching this, a lot of y'all are probably juniors and seniors. Some schools to look out for debate if you want to do debate in college. Western Kentucky University is a great choice. They offer scholarships, which I know that a lot of people need going into college. So that's pretty cool, and that's me. So ready for the background of the topic? Okay. So I'll start us off with a little bit of what this topic is even talking about. So overall, the first word is just United States federal government. I review this every time, mostly because I recognize a lot of people sometimes even like forget between topics. It's like, what's the United States federal government? The United States federal government is the national government. It'll be the body that oversees the 50 states and relevant territories. When we see like the topic like this, very likely it is going to be starting as a bill in Congress, passing through, being signed on by the president, and then not being ruled against by the Supreme Court. So that is what the topic is looking at with the United States federal government, as well as the next word, surveillance infrastructure. This word is kind of confusing at first. So we're looking at surveillance infrastructure. It's going to be the technology and everything that makes up the surveillance on the border. So as in surveillance, it'll be technology that's like viewing either like people, it could be things taking in information. We're seeing this in forms of things like camera technology, biometrics, drones, radars. I was even looking today at like some other examples, like license plate readers are like surveillance technology that exists on the border right now. And so anything that either is actively surveilling or creates the surveillance, makes it possible, then those things are going to be covered under the topic. The topic is about a substantial expansion. So whether or not we're like making the technology better is up for debate for sure in the topic. But we at least know that we're going to take infrastructure that like surveillance that already exists. We're going to be making it possible for technology to be expanded further. And that's functionally the topic. So whether it's entry points, people, vehicles, there's so many things that go into surveillance infrastructure, and it's every part of the process. Something that I compare this to even is energy infrastructure. If we're talking about energy infrastructure, we're not just talking about like a dam or a single solar panel. We're looking at the entire step and process it takes to get from like being a solar panel to your house. That would be the energy infrastructure. So this infrastructure is the same way. So we're doing everything in the process to make the surveillance more possible along more of the border. Next, I just wanted to talk about the word along. I think this is something that a lot of people are going to be having a little bit of like contentious feelings about. The basic idea of it is it's going to be like the border. It's going to be on the border, is the best way to put it. So everything that is on the border, like southern border specifically, would be along for surveillance infrastructure. So I'm talking like putting towers along the border that have cameras. That would be something that we'd be looking at as an example. However, there is something that I wanted to say in it is that there's multiple definitions for along, including accompanying. So things that are going to be not physically present on the like in the line that we call the border still are things that we could be valid, such as body cameras. We don't see those explicitly on people. I mean, like on people that are like touching the line of the border, but it is things that would be accompanying the border in its expansion. So things like entry points, people, all those might not be physically on the line, but it could be around and thus along. So I know some people I've heard so far already have like tried to word shark it as something that honestly it's going to be a pretty broad interpretation for this topic. Finally, the southern border is going to be Mexico. I've heard some people already try to talk about the southern border of Alaska. I've heard some people try to be like, oh, well, Hawaii is the southern border. And it's like, okay, that's what we're talking about. This topic is very explicitly about the border between the United States and Mexico. So no, you can not talk about like pirates below Florida. So yeah, let's move on to some ways to debate this topic. So this thing that I wanted to frame real quick is because there's so much type of technology on this topic. So much. I listed so many already. Like from the list I read, like drones, biometrics, radars, license plate readers, towers, vehicles, people, entry. Like that's so much technology that exists. And there's even more than I just listed. And so something that can be very important beginning your case is something called called an observation, or overview is another way I've heard it. Essentially, it's going to be an argument that you read above your case that's not explicitly offense, but you're showing what this topic is even about. From things that we've seen by camps, by debaters, by rounds online, et cetera, we've already seen so many different types of affirmative. We've seen satellites. We've seen all these different types of technology. And it's like, okay, what parts of these actually fall into the topic, though? And so if you are on the pro side, obviously you're trying to make a little bit more narrow version of the topic. You don't want to be held to every bit of technology. You don't want to make it seem like you're funding the NASA space program. However, if you're on the con side, you probably could benefit from making the affirmative seem like a sweeping action. I mean, because that's how you can generate increased power on things like cost arguments. So that's something that is worth mentioning. When you're on these debates, making sure that you're framing debates in a way through something such as an observation on top of your constructive might help you out a lot. The next thing I want to talk about briefly is frameworks. So something that is, I mean, very like clear on this topic is we are talking about illegal immigrants a lot. Whether you want to or not, illegal immigrants are going to come up a lot on this topic. And so with that, they are our marginalized group for the most part. Like that is something that is going to be very clear. Or even the groups that are going to be mostly interacted with through impacts on this topic are mostly going to be marginalized groups. When we talk about drug related arguments, we see a lot of those hit marginalized communities the most. They hit poorer communities the most. And same thing, there's going to be arguments on the con side about all these ways in which the roots can negatively impact migrants, different ways about how people, maybe even outside of the United States, are dying from impacts on this topic. And so frameworks like minimizing structural violence might be really strategic for you on this topic. Not each side has great access to really big stick impacts. I mean, in the end, we're talking about, yes, like the border, but you're not going to be finding too many like non-problematic arguments that'll be reaching these massive impacts. And so making sure that you might have a framework that you could be talking about cost benefit analysis. If you do have big extinction impacts, for example, on the con, if you have like a argument about illegal immigrants, making sure like illegal immigrants keeping the farming infrastructure up, and then you have some impact about like food insecurity, war, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, you have a big impact. You might be wanting a cost benefit analysis. Or if you're making an argument about how individuals are being affected, maybe in homelessness, that's probably a minimizing structural violence argument instead of being a cost benefit analysis one. And with that, you would want your entire constructive to probably rely and follow through that framework to make the most of your time. So that's it that I wanted to add for just a few little things. But now we're move on to the affirmative side specifically. So I'll be doing the affirmative, and Leonardo will be doing the con side. So first, I want to say for AF tips. So we've all, maybe some of us, at least I know I, over the summer, was having fun following the little bit of debate drama going on between camps. And honestly, it didn't mean anything, but I did think it came out with one really good conclusion that we all need to have. The most important thing on this topic, the best tip I can give for you on the affirmative, don't sound racist. That is the most important thing. If you are standing up and you're going to be talking about how illegal immigrants are the worst thing to ever happen in the United States, I'm not going to lie, you're not going to win any rounds. You're not going to make any friends. It's not going to be a good time for anybody, you or your opponents. Maybe your opponent's happy because they got the win. So that's the first thing. You do not want to be making arguments that are going to be framing people in negative ways based on their birth. So there's two big things that I think I want to talk about with like how to not sound problematic on this topic. The first thing is don't blame illegal immigrants for your problems. If there is an economic problem, chances are it's not strictly because of illegal immigrants. So we could see one example. I'm going to be talking about homelessness arguments in a little bit. And when we talk about those, that's not going to be just about arguments like how illegal immigrants are hurting homelessness. I mean, homelessness problems exist regardless. We're not going to say all of our problems are because of illegal immigrants. The argument may rely on some ways in which, okay, if there's too many homeless people in individual areas, it can cause infighting between groups. But keep in mind, the illegal immigrants are not the unique problem there. We're trying to make the world better for people in multiple groups. You are not trying to demonize people. You are trying to make people's lives better. The second thing is use the word immigrants when you're referring to illegal immigrants. That is a big thing, especially for, I know a lot of younger debaters on this topic. Everybody finds it really easy to use the word immigrants uh, for as an all-encompassing term in the same way that like Trump speeches actively use the word immigrants when it's like you're not getting all immigrants away from increasing border security. Guess what? Immigrants come from so many places around the world, not just Mexico. And a lot of people do come in legally from Mexico too. And this topic is not going to be opposing those people. So we're looking at the benefits of surveillance on the border. We are not trying to demonize illegal immigrants. Okay. That's like the first thing that I think is going to be so important for everybody to hammer down is that if you want to not sound problematic, you have to be focusing on arguments that are not inherently demonizing people just for being illegal immigrants. So the second big tip I have is you want to have a variety of link and internal link arguments. So as a brief review for what a link is, because I know some people here might be their first time in like maybe hearing this term. So when we're looking at contentions, there's usually going to be four main parts to them. There's uniqueness, which is going to be the context, the status quo. There's going to be a link, which is how the topic affects the status quo. There's going to be an impact, which is why all of that even matters in the first place. And there's going to be an internal link, which is going to be if the link doesn't directly cause the impact, then what steps make the link cause the impact? So it's going to be a link chain, as we call it. They're all chained together. So you got from uniqueness to your impact. So what I mean by having a variety of link and internal link arguments on this topic is you probably don't want all of your arguments to hinge on one thing. So for example, if you were to have all of your arguments hinge on an increased amount of illegal immigration. So that'd be something where you're giving your opponent a chance to answer both arguments with one argument. And this topic finds that a lot. There's lots of situations where maybe one technology or one individual circumstance could cause multiple things. And as cool as that is, you don't want to ever pigeonhole yourself into one individual argument. So making sure that you diversify the amount of ways in which the topic can create tangible change before it relates to your impacts can help you out a lot. And part of the way that I structured the AF arguments, the way we're going to go through them, is I specifically chose a lot of arguments that I think have very unique ways of going into the topic. Some of these are ones that maybe I found through my own research. Some of them might be ones that I've heard down the grapevine. And all these I think are ones that at least you should consider because I think that chances are that you see these in a national tournament is at least pretty possible. The third thing I want to talk about is double check your sources and their intentions. So what do I mean by that? There is a lot of people on this topic that are very, very opinionated with not a lot of sources behind them. And I'll get to this in a little bit. Arguments like crime, where people talk all the time about the increased amount of illegal immigration and crime. Most of the statistics, if you look it up, don't have a lot of backing. Or at worst, they're marginal. And so like it's very small and it's not going to be like crime from legal immigration is not something that inherently destroys communities and destroys the United States. So if you find an article that talks about that, I recommend check the source. What is their political affiliation? I say this for both sides. If your source is like very outwardly like probably paid by some Republican firm or very outwardly paid by some Democrat firm, like I'd say probably stay away from that source. There's a lot of really good evidence on this topic that isn't from paid out sources. I recommend try to find it. It'll be a lot better for you, your opponent, and your judge. Maybe not for your opponent because you might actually win. Okay, can we go to the next slide? So now on to all of the arguments for the affirmative that I think are pretty cool. So the first one that I want to talk about is arms trafficking. This is one of my favorite arguments on this topic because one, it has like I've already seen, there's a really cool article that I found that, I mean, can make most of the argument by itself, as well as it's one of the few arguments that's not reliant on immigrants being bad. So the first thing on this argument is that when we look at the trends of guns between the United States and Mexico, right? Mexico doesn't have a lot of guns, at least like not that many that produce. Notably, there's like one main gun store, and it's like on a military base with a lot of protections. It's really hard to get like guns from, and it's like, whoa. So how are 17 million guns now in Mexico? Did one store get 17 million guns? It's like no. The real part of it is that the United States actually has too many guns to the point where it's really easy for them to spill out of the United States, especially when current border security methods are not actually making it hard for you to get from the United States to Mexico, only on the way back. So it's really easy for you to go from the United States to Mexico with large amount of weapons that obviously could kill people, And then we have those being sold. People go back with no harm, but plenty of foul. So when we see that, you get to argue why the United States gun habits are pretty bad. There's lots of really good articles that I found on this topic already. The one that I linked, that I put like in here, a porous border in the river of steel. Weapons trafficked from U.S. bleed Mexico dry. This is an article from like May of this year. It's really good. It's by a either professor or assistant professor at Mexico City, and it's like that's an example of a really good article on this topic for an argument that doesn't demonize Mexico. It so shows how actually border security is way too lenient on the United States. That makes it really easy to get things from the United States into Mexico. And that kills lots of people. I recommend read this article if you just want to get a really quick understanding of the topic because it's super, super good. I recommend checking it out afterwards. Can we get the next slide? Perfect. The next one is drug trafficking. So this is one that we hear a lot on this topic. And I want to clear up how this argument follows my rubric set before of not being problematic. However, the first thing is that's great for lay judges. This is an argument that we've heard time and time again in like common media. We hear this a lot. So for a judge hearing this, this is not anything new and they can understand it very well. Something that helps a lot for lay adaptation is making arguments that the judge feels like they understand. If the judge doesn't understand an argument, they're not going to vote on it. And so things like drug trafficking, judges get a very easy understanding of. And additionally, this argument has a very powerful link story here in that a lot of the drugs that are being smuggled into the United States are not actually made or actually like trafficked through by people that are from Mexico. A lot of them are United States citizens, people from the United States going from the United States down to Mexico and bringing them back through. As well, a lot of the drugs themselves maybe don't start in Mexico. Maybe they start in other countries such as Asia. And so we see this as an argument that doesn't just demonize Mexico for being Mexico. It sees Mexico as a pathway that people go through to do drug trafficking. Additionally, the impacts are definitely felt right now. I don't know if other people know people that have died from things like fentanyl in their lives. I know I have. And so it's like, wow, this is something that a lot of communities have at least some sort of relation to, and that it's an impact that a lot of judges might have actually felt in the past. So for lay judges, that's really good, and it makes it pretty hard to disprove. I mean, the fact that like 100,000 deaths a year from synthetic opioids is not something to laugh at, and it's also something that's rather big and is probably on going to keep on growing. And that's what the topic gets to argue against, especially because most fentanyl is found at the border. So I believe the statistic was like 90% of it is found at the border itself. Once it gets past the border, it's really hard to find and catch. I mean, you can see the border as almost like a funnel that you could catch drugs through. Maybe a funnel, maybe a strainer. There's other words for it. But so drug trafficking is going to be one that you're going to see a lot in this topic. It's going to be one that if you frame it the right way, is actually really persuasive. I will say I've seen some people already try to word it as if it's like Mexicans are bringing over drugs, and it's like, one, this topic is about illegal immigrants. This topic is not like explicitly about like immigrants. This topic is about just should we have things on the border watching for people. So, for example, if one person keeps going over and over many times, it's probably going to be a lot easier for us to catch somebody that has a history of drug trafficking. We go to the next slide, please. Perfect. Crime. You know, everybody's favorite argument in this topic. Here's my advice. Don't use this argument. I think I have to say this again because the amount of times I've seen people try to use this argument, there's just no statistics on it. It's not very good. So illegal immigrants probably are not increasing crime in the country, and you will lose if you use this argument. If nothing else, even if you believe that this is a true argument, here's what I'll say. It's still probably just not persuasive. There's lots of statistics against it, and that means that it's probably not going to be the best for you to use it. There's, unlike other arguments like arms trafficking or like drug trafficking, there generally is just a lot of really good studies that are directly against crime. And so if not for you, if not for like the other people around you, you could do it for you probably 1 rounds, and people are going to have great responses to it, especially considering how much of a target this argument has on its back. So we'll go to the next argument. Body cameras. So this is an argument that I think is also really good. Surveillance infrastructure doesn't just have to be cameras on towers. It can be cameras on police, on border security. So yes, there will be a recording that we'll send out afterwards, Brandon. We will. Okay, so body cameras. is a really good argument on this topic. I say mostly because it's a super small F approach. So what do I mean by a super small F approach? So when you are framing how the topic is increasing, you can kind of draw your own parameters a little bit. Well, obviously, the topic is going to be seen as a general principle at all times. If all of your arguments are about certain types of technologies, it's really hard for the con side to frame you as a villain for technologies you're not even talking about. So if nothing else, from a judge's perspective, you can frame what kind of technologies the topic is increasing by how you argue it. Because if you're talking about like body cameras, and the negative side is going for arguments like, oh, they're trying to build a wall. It's like, okay, I don't think the affirmative is talking about that. Maybe let's have something a little more engaging. The affirmative, in many ways, sets the debate. So body cameras is a super cool argument because the one, it's a relatively small F approach. And the other thing is has good intrinsic arguments to it. And additionally, when I talk about intrinsic arguments, it's like, okay, if you're looking at a topic, you could, in theory, get very contrived out there impacts. I think back to topics like biometrics, where when we debated the biometrics topic, like a little bit more than a year ago, I remember people were arguing arguments like lost pets. I remember people were arguing arguments like fitness trackers. It's like, okay, that's a very out there argument on this topic. That's not intrinsic to what's going on. However, body cameras have really good literature in very strong like things that are specific to body cameras. That specificness is very valuable for you to one, make a really good push on your case, but also to avoid the opponent being like status quo solves, avoid them saying alternate causes, alternate solutions. Like whatever they're saying, the fact that body cameras probably are a uniquely good solution to solve things like corruption is really big. A lot of areas either don't enforce it, a lot of body cameras get turned off. I mean, the amount of times I feel like in current news where I'll look at some event of like, maybe body cam could make argue this financial increase. We'll answer all questions at the end. How about that? I'm like, I could look at the chat for forever, but we'll answer all questions at the end. It's, I believe, like slide 25. So for body cameras, here's to say there's lots of strong arguments specific to body cameras that no other offense can get, which means that the con side can't say status quo solves, which is really good. Things like corruption, things like racism are uniquely tied to body cameras. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Perfect. Homelessness is another, I think, really interesting argument on this topic. So this argument, to be clear, I'm not saying that all immigrants that come become homeless. I'm also not going to be saying that like this is something that is caused in any one scenario. However, we can see that in lots of cities, there are like too many people and not enough houses. I think that housing could fit in two ways on this topic. One of them I'm going to be covering later called as a housing crisis, where you can talk about house prices as well. But for homelessness specifically, we get to look at how the increased amount of people coming into the country in many ways makes it where there's lots of people that need housing. However, when a lot of people come and need housing, the most in-demand housing right now isn't your high-income housing, which there's a lot of, it's low-income housing. The amount of low-income housing available is kind of becoming more far and few between, especially in the areas that most people need them. Like I think right now, I'm up in Bowling Green, Kentucky. If you want to get an apartment for less than like $1,000 a month, you can get an apartment here for less than $1,000 a month. In cities like I used to be in Atlanta, and it's like, oh, when you're in Atlanta, if you want a one-bedroom apartment, you're not going to be easily finding it under 2,000 or at least under like 1,500 a month. So depending where you are, low house housing might be very different. However, we can see in general, it's one of the very high demand things right now. A lot of people can't pay for it. So when we see the amount of low income housing being at high demand, we see a lot of people, more and more people becoming homeless in different areas. And the idea is that illegal immigrants make it a lot harder to maintain this problem. There's actually really good articles about how like the increased amount of illegal immigrants, it's not that they're like making anything worse, but it's that there's not enough resources to go around. And in doing so, causes resources to cause infighting within groups within cities. And so we can see homelessness actively causing more issues because there's only so many resources to go around, and we already can't handle current homeless populations. And so it's a scalar argument where you see, okay, homelessness already is a problem. And as more people come to the United States without, much of an ability to secure housing, I say this not as a stereotype, but I mean, like we could generally look when people are coming crossing the border illegally. Chances are they're not rich. I think that's something that we could say pretty safely. They probably won't be able to afford the high income housing that is available, and so that increases pressure for housing. That increases the amount of people homeless, and it means that there's more resources that have to be divided up in areas, which can make it a lot harder for already struggling homelessness infrastructure. And also, in case anybody isn't aware of anti-homeless infrastructure, I include some pictures of anti-homeless benches because it's very interesting. And if you look around your cities, you might realize more and more how cities design things like benches to make it harder for homeless people to sleep on them. So that's a little PSA. We're just like, yeah, that's interesting. I recommend looking out for it because it's something that for some people problematic. For some people, maybe they want it. I don't know. Okay, we go to the next argument. Elections. So this one I find very, very interesting on this topic. And I think that especially for lay judges, it's probably not going to be as persuasive, but it's one that especially with the demographics of judges, mostly on the national circuit, if you plan to compete at the national circuit a lot, if you get like a people called tech judges, then this argument could be very good. So this argument is elections. We can see that right now. I mean, actually, if anybody is unfamiliar with politics and how politics arguments works, politics arguments look at the trade-off of how people view politicians right now. So election is one example of this, where the argument is not about the topic itself. It's about the inherent trade-offs in public perception or in like governments, like how they can perceive each other. And that's how they might like react. So, for example, elections arguments are a politics type argument that'll look at, okay, right now, this person's winning in the election. If we pass the topic, it'll change how voters vote one way or another, and that has an impact. So, one argument that we can see here is that you could argue that right now, Kamala and Trump are in a tight race. You could say that securing a strong border policy could make Kamala look strong and win her the election. And you could argue that Trump caused like extinction. So that's one. I've yet to see one like an argument that like is about like Kamala losing being good. However, if you want, you probably could try that, even though I don't recommend it. So elections arguments are going to be really good, mostly because right now it's still not a one race for either politician. I will say the uniqueness isn't as good recently as it was back in like June. If anybody was cutting elections arguments back in June, oh, it was pretty good. So who knows? As the election cycle continues, this argument might pop up on your radar because it gets access to an impact that a lot of circuit judges find rather persuasive, as well as it's something that gets to look at the inherent trade-offs that policies have with election cycles. I believe I have three arguments left, so we'll get to those. So next one I want to talk about. This one I'm not a huge fan of, but I think it's worth talking about because it's, you know, if you're to be debating on this topic on the national circuit, you might end up coming across a few arguments that are a little more interesting. And I think disease is one of the arguments that has a really hard to beat impact sometimes, which is why it's like you might want to at least know this is probably going to be a relevant argument on this topic. So the argument here would be that securing the border could be important in the times of pandemics. So we can see that on the border, there's lots of unsanitary conditions. And in doing additionally, with the inability to regulate like borders, we can see that people could come through with diseases that could spread and become pandemics. So this argument in many ways feels like it's one that, depending on how you write it, could come off a little bit bad because we're not trying to blame a disease on any other country. So you don't be a little bit careful about it. However, pandemics is always a really good high magnitude, low risk impact. So I think back on, I'm trying to think of what topics recently, like pandemics we're seeing on. I guess like single use plastics pandemics is a pretty good argument. Where yes, chances are a pandemic isn't like the most likely thing ever, but the idea is your final focus is going to be phrased like if there is any chance of a pandemic, we probably should avoid it because there's a chance to kill everybody because pandemics are going to get worse and worse and worse. So it's one of those very interesting impacts, and you at least might want to be aware of it. And things like surveillance infrastructure could have some added benefits to like solve disease through, not like let me not solve disease, but mitigate it through reading people's things like your temperature, being able to see if people are coughing, like the what's called like the gait of people. Those are things that surveillance infrastructure can track if they're programmed to, and so it can help solve disease potentially. Next slide. this one is another one that is, I think, an impact about Mexico. So this one is called brain drain. So this is an argument that we've seen a lot in previous topics, but I think is worth referring to because right now you could say there's not a lot of career incentives to stay in Mexico. If somebody's a doctor, they'd probably make more in the United States than they would in Mexico. Somebody wants to go to school, they'd probably make more in the United States than Mexico, or even than a lot of countries below, just south of the border, even in Central or South America. So with that, there's a lot of reasons why people would want to come to the United States with at least the hope of finding a better job. It even could be somebody being like a plumber, an electrician, a skill that is very important, very needed, and you can do with very little regulation in the United States. I am like curious if there's like stats on like how many skilled workers that are like plumbers, electricians like commit tax fraud. I feel like it's got to be really high. But so beyond that, it's something it's relatively easy for people to get into, and so people can go in the United States illegally in the hope of utilizing their skills, and that could be really good. However, there is a really good argument against it, which that people could with skills are able to come in like legally easier. However, it's still worth looking at as an argument that I think there is like some decent literature on. I know that at least my groups so far have found cards for it. I recommend you try your best to do the same. Additionally, the impact is really interesting because you get to talk about how it hurts the Mexican economy. And so it's an economy impact that you get to win on Mexico, which means that you could win impact defense on United States economy arguments while also still winning your own economy argument from a whole different country. And that means you still get access to an impact without having to worry about like your responses to your opponent possibly being framed poorly. And we'll go to the final argument real quick. Okay, so this argument, housing bubble slash housing crisis, you could call it. So this is really, really interesting because these arguments we can look at about how low-income housing is lacking right now and how more and more people adding to the low-income housing market could cause issues for as housing realizes that the demand is increased. They can play with the prices a lot. And we can even see like housing bubbles possibly going to pop sometime in the next few years. And so how you read this argument is all up to you. However, I found that there's a lot of really interesting articles on how like housing being so fought over right now can cause lots of infighting within communities. For example, there's one that I saw where it's like when American communities think they're fighting like immigrants or illegal immigrants for housing, it increases xenophobia in areas where low-income housing is becoming less available. And so there's structural violence impacts that we have there, as well as general poverty impacts. And then when people can't access housing or they have to pay more for housing by having to go to a more expensive area, then that probably is not good for the economy, considering a lot of like the money that we see going into housing is not one that constantly gets reinvested and put back into the economy, causing growth, which means that all this money going in feels sometimes like it's lost to the void. Okay, I'm gonna go to a last miscellaneous argument section. There's a few arguments that just, you know what, if you want, I recommend check it out. There's definitely interesting court clog arguments, how you could look at asylum and how people apply for that. Could possibly overwhelm different court systems. There's arguments that you could look at about agriculture. So, for example, I know there's definitely, if you look up arguments about undocumented immigrants and farming, there's actually a good amount of like articles that look at how there is like risk of cross-contamination and disease from when people come across the borders and walk directly through farms, for example, on the border with Arizona. So when people walk through the borders in Arizona, like let's say somebody, and I know we're all grown up here, when they urinate or poop on crops, people can't keep the crops. I'm not gonna lie. I don't know about y'all. I don't want crops that have been used as a toilet. I think most people don't want those either. So, however, the regulations laid out by the FDA make it where farmers have to throw it not just those, but even like entire small areas of crops when people that are undocumented have walked through. And so things like that, agriculture could work. By the way, all these arguments are ones that I don't think maybe are perfect yet, but maybe if a new article comes out within the next like few weeks, these could be probably genuine arguments you could turn into things. The next argument I think is background checks, which this is one that I know we've had a universal background checks argument like topic in the past, like gun ownership, I believe. But this is one that I find very interesting. You could see the benefits of background checks being done on people entering the country, and how surveillance infrastructure doesn't just have to be things like cameras. It could be the whole system of having people enter the United States, checking their identities. And so, if you wanted to take a very small approach to the topic, background checks could totally be your argument. I don't think that there's a lot of negative effects to having increased amount of background checks on people coming through, because that also affects people legally coming through. So if you wanted to make a argument about like generally like who are people checking more to see like if we could like maybe not solve crime, but like if there even if there is increase, mitigating even more, background checks would be good there. I also think there's another argument that we could make about how becoming legal potentially could become easier if we make the system have more resources and trade offs in different ways. So substantially increasing surveillance infrastructure could increase infrastructure more than just stopping illegal immigrants. This could be increasing pathways for people to go through, people getting legal routes to citizenship, as well as maybe possibly even increasing the sector of like checking for visas. That's it for today, at least from me. So have fun, don't sound xenophobic, and we're gonna look at the negative arguments now and leave us to tear me apart.
All right. Well, that was a great presentation by Joshua there. I'm not sure how I'm going to keep up with that, but yeah, let's move on to the negative here. And I've kind of simplified the neg into 5 main areas or approaches in order to kind of help condense them, since I think the neg is going to have a lot of these, like a bunch of similar arguments, which can be grouped into these 5 main areas. So the first being cost, the second being racism, the third being anything related to impacts on immigrants or specifically undocumented immigrants who are coming in. The fourth is statesmanship, which is a fancier word for things like relations with other countries. And the fifth is privacy. So the reason I actually used statesmanship here was to simplify this into an acronym, which is CRISP, so that it's a bit easier to remember. But yeah, let's get started with the first area, which is cost. And this is probably going to be one of the most common arguments you're going to face if you're on the AF and you're facing teams on the neg. And it's probably one of the best arguments on the neg to run. Because if you think about currently what is one of the main things stopping anything going to the border, right? It's about funding issues. It's about the high cost of this substantial expansion at the border. Since the border is a long region, there are many places where there's very low coverage. So if we're going to substantially expand, if we're going to try to fully cover our border with surveillance, that's going to take a lot of money and a lot of resources. So obviously, with any cost argument, there has to be a funding mechanism. How are we going to fund this gigantic cost? And there's 3 main areas for pretty much any government program or government spending on some new thing. First is going to be a trade-off. So we're going to take money from someplace, we're going to move it to here. And obviously, there are many negatives that come with that you can point out on the neg. For example, it comes from key programs such as welfare programs or healthcare programs, right? Those programs, which are very important for many, like millions of Americans, those are going to be cut, they're going to be slashed. And obviously, that has many negative impacts that you can go for. Second is going to be taxes. And the interesting thing about taxes is that initially, right, a lot of AF teams might seek to spin this as, hey, we're going to tax the rich in order to do this, right? But obviously, you can easily block against that. You can easily defend against that because right now, in our current country's tax system, obviously there are higher tax brackets for the rich, but there are actually kind of higher taxes on the earned income for the middle class and the lower class as compared to the rich. Since if you do a little bit of research here, the middle class and lower class typically earn their income through labor, right? So it would be income taxes which affect them. However, the rich often get it through things like capital gains from investments. And capital gains tax rates are lower than income tax rates. So that's one way you can defend this argument of the taxes and use it to prove that, hey, well, these taxes, all the funding that's coming for this border surveillance, it's not going to be from the ultra wealthy. It's going to be from the average American in the middle class or even the lower class. And the final argument is going to be about deficit spending. So obviously, the government often increases deficit spending. We did it during COVID. We've done it before many times. And there are lots of there's mainly one negative consequence from that. And the biggest one is basically inflation, right? Throughout COVID, we've seen that there's been a lot of issues with inflation as a result of like massive deficit spending, obviously on top of supply chain issues and, for example, the war in Ukraine. But deficit spending is definitely a key contributing factor, which you can argue on the neg is going to be one of these sources to fund this gigantic cost. So out of these costs, right, the reason why cost arguments are very fun is because you get to pick and choose kind of which ones you go for, right? If, for example, you find this very niche program that the government might cut soon, right, as a result of funding surveillance, you can go for a very good impact there, right? If you, for example, want to stick to taxes or deficit spending for an inflation impact or just a general hurting the middle class impact, you can go for that as well. And finally, to kind of wrap up this argument, that was the bulk of the argument. But there's one key thing to remember here, which is that the economy has very key political implications. Given that we are in an election year and the election is in a few months, right? If the economy goes sideways right now, that's not going to be a good picture. That's not going to reflect too well on the current administration. So, kind of on the flip side of the AF politics argument, the neg politics argument would argue that actually right now Kamala is leading in the polls, Kamala is going to win. But then suddenly, if under a Democratic presidential administration, the economy just goes terribly, right? We somehow enter a recession. People are probably not going to vote for Kamala. They're probably going to switch over to Trump. So yeah, those are the political implications here. Moving on to the second argument, which is racism. This is also going to be a pretty common argument, especially in tech rounds where you see things such as structural violence frameworks. A lot of teams are going to try to bring up racism as an argument because it is a pretty prevalent argument within the history of the US, right? There's probably a lot of literature about mass surveillance and how the government has used that within throughout like the history of surveillance within the US. And historically, it's been used a lot of times in specifically communities with people of color, right? Communities of color have been targeted by mass surveillance a lot. And the critical thing about this argument is that specifically along the border, there are lots of people of color living there. Specifically, I think there's a lot of Hispanic communities. So the impacts of this wouldn't just be talking about undocumented immigrants. It would also be talking about just Hispanic communities living alongside the border because it's surveillance along the border, right? Which doesn't just mean people crossing in. It could also mean just generally alongside the border, there's going to be negative impacts there. And another part of this argument is that a lot of surveillance, right, such as biometric recognition technology, if you actually debated the PF topic about that, which I believe was last year's TOC for 2023 about biometrics, right, there was a common argument about how biometrics are very racially biased because a lot of their data sets are flawed and they misidentified, I believe, Black Americans much more frequently than white Americans, right? That could be an easy argument to also add in to this aspect of racism as well, because a lot of these surveillance, right, if your opponents or even you argue that it's going to be biometric recognition technology, specifically such as facial recognition, that can easily link in to having racial biases and obviously have the impact of racism. Another two key arguments here. First is trust in law enforcement, right? Typically speaking, right, if there's a lot of surveillance around your house, obviously you're not going to trust the people using it too much because they're staring at you 24/7 and you're kind of wondering what exactly they're doing, right? Because you have no privacy here. So that means that, especially if you are part of a marginalized community, you're probably going to have decreased trust in law enforcement, especially given the history of law enforcement and marginalized communities and their interactions. So that's going to magnify this effect. And obviously, this could be kind of a way to mitigate a lot of after impacts about law enforcement being effective. Because if trust is eroded, well, obviously law enforcement is not going to be as effective in actually doing a good job. And the final argument is about indigenous land, since a lot of the land around the southern border between the US and Mexico is actually indigenous land, which means that if the government is going to install giant towers there for surveillance, right, that's going to have a lot of issues with regards to like the rights of indigenous people living on those lands and their sovereignty among their lands. So yeah, that pretty much wraps up this second main focus about racism. And the third argument or kind of main focus is going to be impacts on immigrants. And I think this is probably the most direct argument here because it's not kind of an argument with like multiple facets. It's kind of just one like main link, but it's a very good link, I think, because it's probably very true, which is that undocumented immigrants, since they typically wish to avoid law enforcement as part of their entry, more surveillance in these giant areas is going to push them to even more dangerous routes, which is going to lead often to things like death, but not just death. It's going to lead them to things such as being more vulnerable to human trafficking because a lot of human traffickers, in order to actually target their victims, they go to places where it's very hard to track them, right? They go to these places where not many eyes are being put. And obviously the AF might spin it to say, hey, well, more surveillance is good. But the thing is, the NEG should argue that you can never cover 100%. And if we're pushing away these areas where we have some idea of what's going on, but not a complete idea, and we try to increase surveillance there, that's going to push them away to places where we have no eyes on, right? Even things like tunnels, right? Underground, that is one key path that a lot of people take to cross into the US. So that's kind of one of the other impacts besides for death to this argument here. And the final impact that I thought of was psychological impacts, right? Surveillance, if you do a bit of research, has some psychological impacts such as increased stress and anxiety, right? If you're being spied on 24/7, especially if it's a mass substantial increase in this surveillance. So that could be something to link into, especially if you want to make some framework about mental health, for example. And really quickly about the question in chat, we'll get to that right towards the end of the slideshow presentation. So yeah, moving on to the fourth area for the neg, it's going to be statesmanship or basically foreign relations, right? Foreign policy. And this argument also relies on one main link, which is that how would Mexico feel, right, as a result of this substantial expansion along our border? To kind of put this into perspective, right? Let's say it was some other country, right? Some other country border the US, and maybe we were like kind of friends with them, right? But then suddenly one day, right, they have a massive increase in surveillance pointed towards us, pointed towards our borders, right? Typically, that's not going to be seen as something that's very friendly. That's not going to be seen as a friendly move. So Mexico can respond with different forms of retaliation, right? Because they perceive this substantial increase in surveillance as hostile. For example, they could reduce cooperation in many areas, right? One of the main areas is intelligence sharing to combat things such as drug cartels, because right now the US and Mexico, their governments cooperate a lot to kind of try to combat organized crime. But obviously, if Mexico and the government view the US's actions as very hostile, they're probably not going to be as cooperative. They might break off agreements in other areas such as counterterrorism, and there's many impacts off of that if you look into specific areas in which Mexico and the US cooperate, right? And I think another interesting area that they could retaliate in is legal action, because there are lots of forums, I believe, where Mexico can actually challenge the US's actions, right? If they argue that the US is violating a lot of basic civil liberties and human rights as a result of this substantial expansion in surveillance, right? They can also that can help mitigate kind of the potential benefits of surveillance, because if somehow, right, Mexico continues to challenge the US's surveillance in through legal action in these international courts, and they actually are able to get rid of it in a few years, that means that all the after impacts, which rely on long-term impacts, aren't probably going to happen because this legal action is going to bog them down or even get rid of it. Even if it doesn't completely get rid of this surveillance, it's going to bog it down severely, and it's going to cost the US a lot, which also can link back into things such as the cost argument and that area, which I previously mentioned. So yeah, that's quite an interesting argument. And the final place that I wanted to cover was about privacy. So this argument doesn't have as much tangible impact as the previous arguments, but it's still quite an interesting argument to look down because this is probably one of the main concerns with surveillance in general, right? That basically surveillance, by its definition, right, it's looking at you, it's spying at you. So that's probably going to violate a lot of civil liberties, and especially given the government's history with surveillance. And there are lots of potentials to kind of talk about, obviously, courts, right, and court clogs, because when you have this huge expansion of surveillance, right, there are lots of groups which advocate for civil liberties, which are probably going to sue, right? That could lead to court clog. And obviously, there are many impacts off of court clog, which are pretty bad, right? Most notably, I think most teams generally run that, it stops other things which need the courts to be active and not clogged, right? Such as things like drug innovation. And I think another argument that comes off of this whole concern about privacy is surveillance creep. And essentially, this is the idea that the government might start by having this huge expansion of surveillance in one area, in this case, the southern border between the US and Mexico, but then that eventually creeps into other places, right? They might start using it throughout the whole US, right? They might start shipping it off to foreign places, things like that, right? You can look into many examples probably of other countries doing this, or generally the US doing this in the past. And the impact off of this, right, is kind of taking what we've talked about with impacts on undocumented immigrants in the third area and kind of applying it to domestically, right? Because currently there are lots of undocumented immigrants within the US, which means that if we have expanded surveillance creep, that could potentially be used to deport them, right? That could have even terrible impacts for the people currently in the US, not just people who are looking to cross the border between the US and Mexico. So to kind of summarize, right, first main area was cost, right? Very versatile argument. You can choose the funding mechanism. The second area was about racism, right? You can specifically talk about, for example, Hispanic communities living along the border or Native American lands along the border as well. The third main argument was about impact on undocumented immigrants, right? Particularly the fact that surveillance forces them to more dangerous routes where they're more vulnerable to death, trafficking, and psychological impacts. The fourth is going to be about statesmanship, right? Essentially, Mexico is going to view the U.S. action as very hostile and retaliate in many different areas. Once again, a pretty versatile argument. And the fifth is going to be about privacy, which is that the U.S. government doesn't have a great history with surveillance, right? And obviously, this surveillance is probably not going to just stick to the southern border. It's going to expand and have a lot of negative impacts throughout the U.S. So yeah, I think that's the last slide here before we move on to any questions. So I think we can start with the question, I think Shan's question about body cams. So Joshua, you could probably take that.
Yeah. So I think that, but like in general, if you look at surveillance infrastructure on the border, if we increase surveillance infrastructure, chances are we're increasing the amount of people on the border too, because people are a part of infrastructure. In the same way, if we were going to expand energy infrastructure, guess what? We need more people to build solar panels. We need more people to regulate things, regulate dams, etc. So I think like a lot of questions about this topic, I think it answered with the idea of like, would we need this? Like to make the topic happen. Because if so, then chances are it's falling under the topic. So yeah, it would increase higher personnel. And yeah, what's the main ooh Leto answer to Gabby's question?
Yeah, I can take that question over there. So the main reduction in cooperation, right? Um, I think that Mexico kind of not telling the US ties into basically breaking off cooperation in things like intelligence sharing, right? So that would be basically if I think right now Mexico and the US get have joint operations where they're trying to basically target organized crime, right? But if Mexico retaliates and kind of shuts off this cooperation, right, they're not going to share a lot of information that they have about, for example, where cartels are, right? Who the key leaders are, things like that. And the US is going to have to do that work, for example, themselves, right? Which is going to take a lot more resources and it's going to cost even more. Um, and yeah, I think there's other areas such as counterterrorism and probably water as well, since I know that there's a lot of issues with like water scarcity along the border and like the Rio Grande. I believe there was one question quickly above that, which was best framing cards. So, Joshua, I think you mentioned like some framing ideas. Yeah, I'm only familiar with like kind of general like structural violence framing cards, which are probably on the wiki and you can find those.
Yeah, I feel like a general sentiment for like, I feel like I don't want to, like, in the next way possible, I'm not here to write interviews cases for them. But also, as far as like, I mean, there's very basic ones that we can look at, such as like winter and late in, because essentially, the cards that are going to be you're going to use for framing are they don't need to be super specific. They can be general ones that look at the fact that like I think the key warrants to look for because I think what makes like instead of saying which cards, I'm gonna say what warrants to look for. When you're making warrants for framework, you want to be isolating things about how is discourse happening right now, and then why does it need to change. So when I'm looking at good framework cards, I'm looking for cards that are like taking some aspect of like right now we are overlooking minority groups and that needs to change because of this. So instead of thinking about like which card specifically, I recommend that find ones to suit your need. Because also, I think there's some structural violence cards that are like really interesting about like, for example, the ones that are like, oh, structural violence causes extinction because like it overwhelm like creates political instability, blah blah blah. So like you could go various ways depending on how you want to take it, but like do that's more up to you on how you like want to run your affirmative because you could technically make things uh like you could make something like structural violence become a big impact, even though I feel like that's all up to you. So yeah. I also got a direct message question from Peyton. So
Mhm.
for the app, is human trafficking and search and rescue programs of migrants good arguments? Yeah. So I didn't mention those explicitly, but I think that the idea that surveillance could help stop human trafficking, I think is overall a pretty good argument. I do think that there is one issue with the human trafficking arguments, and I think it's that it's one of the ones that very like easily falls to like traffickers find a way around it. Uh, Additionally, there's a chance that like funneling arguments could also just like frankly like do the same thing but worse, such as like if we make it where there's even less routes that people go to cross the border. I think to be fair, I didn't find this statistic myself. I was talking to some friend who was a coach the other day too. I mean, there's like some statistic like 60% of like kids that like cross the border like get caught or something like that by like cartels. It's like, oh, I don't. There's a lot of like things you can see where the way the border works right now is like traffickers can catch people as they're crossing the border along individualized paths, and so if they do something like that, then I think the argument could be a little bit weaker. So that's like my biggest problem with that. I think search and rescue programs, I haven't experimented with that at all. I'm not here to talk about arguments I haven't researched because, frankly, that'd be a bad move for me to do. We're here to talk about things we've researched. So I think it could be good. If you ever want, feel free. Anybody can like send me ideas or questions at any time on Discord. So feel free to. I'm always happy to answer questions. Like if you've researched an argument, you want me to look over something, happily will.
And I also
Uh,
got a quick direct message from Peyton as well. I think I think two main arguments. So first is hurting migrants, and second about border town economies. So obviously, as I previously mentioned, I think that hurting migrants is probably one of the kind of like main arguments on the neg, right? It's probably very good in literature because it is one of the like main reasons why a lot of people oppose increased surveillance, right? So kind of considering like the amount of literature that exists about this topic, right? A lot of it is going to be a lot of it on the neg is going to be kind of centered around impacts towards immigrants, right? Specifically undocumented immigrants. And I think that border town economies is actually an argument that I haven't looked into too much. I think it's a potentially very good argument, right? Which you could kind of just generally do research about why surveillance, like let's say infrastructure has like negative economic effects, right? And kind of specifically applied to the border. You could also take things such as like, the whole argument about privacy and specifically apply to within the border, right? But yeah, I think that's something you should definitely look more into. I think the next question is from Gabby about kind of rebuttals on the neg. So I believe I can quickly take this one, right? I think oh wait, is it rebuttals? I believe actually it's rebuttals to the neg that the app should use. So yeah, I think Joshua, the floor is yours.
yeah, sure. Okay. So the cost argument seems really scary at first. And I think there's a lot of really interesting cost arguments in relation to politics as well as in relation to I think one of the big ones funny like that wasn't even mentioned is like immigrants single-handedly fund like if like not only immigrants, also like illegal immigrants single-handedly fund like a lot of like social security, like a lot of it. Like I'm talking like people that are not legal citizens, like that can't get access to social security because like I mean basic logic, if you can't get a social security card, chances are you're not getting social security benefits. Uh, if that's happening, guess what? You're still paying money into it through income taxes. So whether or not you're a citizen, you're still paying money through income taxes. That's like really big. So I think that's like a big argument for the con, like for the con and neg that is there. But also, if you're in the affirmative, I mean, most of the arguments you could make are like, look, how much money we spend on other things. Like, I'm not gonna lie, if spending like an extra, let's say like 15, 20 billion, even that's like probably more than it would be, like 15, $20 billion on like border security, like look how much money was spent during the pandemic. I mean, like during the pandemic on like stimulus checks, literally over $1 trillion. So I don't think there was a massive impact from that. At least like obviously there technically is in like inflation, but like there wasn't like an extinction level impact from that that we could see coming, as well as when we see the argument, you could argue that like yes, it costs a lot, but it has a lot of benefit. So one way that I've been weighing it, so for example, let's say you have a drug trafficking affirmative, you could then argue the economic impacts of drug deaths or drug like drug overdoses, drug addictions. Like there is really good statistics that like drug usage costs the company and costs the country billions of dollars a year in like loss of productivity and like people dying. Dying is expensive. I don't know if y'all have seen a funeral check before. That's expensive. So drug deaths is something that I would be like just weigh the affirmative versus it. Like, yes, it costs a lot. Other things cost a lot. We're doing it for a good thing. The way I like to frame it always is like you can almost always end your speech with like, look, the con side sounds like it's bad, but the act is still a good idea. And if you frame it like that, it's like, yes, it costs a lot, but that's okay. Things cost money. Like in theory, if you're trying to like save money every day, I'd like never go get like Taco Bell. But guess what? Money is meant to be spent. So that's if that helps the logic of it, then yeah. We'll skip the question of the Hawaii app because that's not a thing. I joke. If you really wanted to, I guess you like could do it. I don't think it's an intrinsic argument to the topic, and so that would be my main worry, especially when I feel like the topic is about expansion instead of like increasing on individual areas. Because of that, you have the burden of proving uniqueness in that right now there is not enough surveillance like in Hawaii. And I'm like, I don't know if that I haven't researched this. And it doesn't sound like an argument that as a judge that's going to be like on the circuit this year, I don't think I'd be particularly compelled. And so that's where I'll leave you there. Like if you want to use arguments that feel really wacky, cool, but I'm probably not going to be compelled as a judge. And I say that as probably like one of the judges willing to vote on the craziest stuff in the circuit. So I'd say watch out for that. Let's see.
One other quick addition was that I think kind of on a technicality, I don't think Hawaii actually like has, I guess, borders with like any other countries. And like I think the closest country to Hawaii is actually like the United States, right? So I think it would be a little harder to kind of argue that. But I guess if you really wanted to, you could still technically argue, like state borders or things like that. So yeah. I think the next question was, is surveillance like infrastructure a term of art? I'm not too sure what that's asking. Maybe you could like clarify it. Um, yeah, Joshua, even any idea of what kind of this is about?
Yeah, I think that question's a bit of a troll. I will say the next one is about like defining parameters. So I think I'll take that real quick. So is defining and setting parameters for what surveillance infrastructure is recommended for both cases, one or the other, or none? So I think that it makes sense to do if you think it'll help your case. That's probably the best way to look at it. If you are like making arguments that you think would explicitly benefit from one type of technology or the other being what the topic is about, then you probably should frame it that way. In the same way, if your entire affirmative is about background checks, you probably would want some sort of observation that one, background checks are included and that they are like normal means, something like that. In the same way, if you're doing it about like body cameras, you probably should specify that at the beginning of your case, being like body cameras are part of surveillance infrastructure. If you're doing about like if your entire case relies on a specific technology being there, then it's probably good to have in your constructive because the way that I like to look at it is when you're frontlining in the second rebuttal of the first summary, you should never need to read new cards to defend your case. Your case should always be able to be completely defended with only the rhetoric of the constructive. If there's something that you need to read cards against in the second rebuttal or the first summary to defend your case, then that's something that simply you are wasting time because you could have made your case better. So that'd be the best way to say it. If you think there's a chance that you'd have to read cards on this in the second rebuttal or first summary because this technology you're saying is like not intrinsic enough to the topic, that's when you really want to define it. The other scenario to define it is if you're trying to narrow the ground the opponent can link to. So let's say if you were to do it, say, actually the only infrastructure we're increasing is body cameras. If you were to create an observation about that, to be fair, that's probably not going to win a lot because that's like a very too narrow version of the topic. But you can functionally narrow what the topic is through saying what normal means is. So actually, I remember like an argument back in the Arctic topic last year that I thought was super interesting was arguments about the Space Force, where you could say, like the topic was increasing Arctic infrastructure, like military like investment. So it was increasing Arctic military investment. And so one argument that I would read was like there was a card that was like 80% of Arctic investment is Space Force. And so then we'd make arguments about the Space Force for that. So it was like we would set a parameter. We were like, guess what? This is most of what this is talking about. We're not talking about this other stuff that they're probably going to read dissents to. Uh, so that also, if there's a rebuttal, is there a rebuttal against racism? Uh, like, I mean, just respond to it, make arguments. Debate is kind of cool because you could debate. Like,
Hmm.
you can make arguments that like you're better for certain individualized groups. Like, I think the like, and when I talk about the affirmative, there's I outlined strategies for like if you look at homelessness, the idea that like poor communities already uh in various cities around the country are like already struggling for resources, and like increased like illegal immigrants could possibly increase that more. We could see arguments about how like drug trafficking uniquely hurts poor and racialized communities even more. So you could make impacts. A lot of it's just like weigh your case, but also it depends on what the argument is about racism. So it's about perception. You can make arguments that like people's perception isn't based on like a singular policy. You could make arguments about how depending on like which racism argument it is. If arguments about like discrimination on the border, you can make arguments about how to be fair, I don't want you to just say that it's just whoever's at the border. We can make arguments that are more about maybe we're deterring. Like if we are deterring people from the border, then maybe they're not actually crossing in the first place, and having those negative effects, such as the dangerous routes, such as like being cracked down on more. So there's stuff you can see about that as possible responses to like racism. And you need cards for definitions. I would say, I mean, if you don't have a card for definition, then if they say, "What's your source of the definition?" saying yourself isn't very credible. I would recommend that all of your arguments in the constructive are carded because it's the one speech that you can fully make perfect. Your religious text to the round is your constructive speech. That is all that is good in your world. Make it good.
Yeah, and to quickly kind of add on about kind of responding to racism, there was one actually, I think, pretty frequent response to it on the biometrics topic, which is essentially that, surveillance might actually trade off with law enforcement so that it's not necessarily, they both increase at the same time. They might reduce the need for it as because of reasons like Joshua mentioned previously about deterrence, right? So if it actually deters them, there's less need for law enforcement. And obviously, most teams that are arguing that, surveillance is racist are probably going to include law enforcement with that. So if you can prove that there's a trade-off, then that's going to be on net beneficial. And yeah, I think going back to yeah, I think there's only like one addition to the previous question about like is surveillance infrastructure term of art. Um, so you need your T cards. I think that that could be something that you look into. Um, I personally don't think there's much saying that um, infrastructure, like surveillance infrastructure, is specifically art. But if you can find that, then obviously, go wild and run what you have in mind there. So yeah. Are there any more questions before we kind of conclude this lecture? All right,
Cool.
yeah, I think we're good. So, once again, thank you everyone for showing up here. Yeah, thank you, Joshua, for presenting with me as well.
Right
And
back at you.
yeah, awesome. Well, since that's pretty much it, everyone have a great day.